Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 45 of What's Tom Reading. I'm Tom, and today we are going to be talking about one of the all-time great pieces of English literature, Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This book is not only good, not only beautiful, but important as well. If you're ready to go deep, then stay tuned and enjoy the show. All right, so as I said, today we are talking about Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a great book that I first read back in my college days. It was hugely impactful to me then, but I read sort of so many books back then that this one kind of slipped into the noise a little bit. It took a little bit of a refresher for me from my notes and a paper that I once wrote for it all to come back to me, and it all came rushing back in force. As I'm sitting here, I'm looking out my window at a drizzly Scottish sky, and you will notice, longtime listeners to the podcast, that the audio for this episode is substantially different. I hope it's an improvement. It's something that I've been working on. I've been sort of trying to educate myself to make this more of a pleasing sound. I'm using the tools that I have as best as I can, and I'm also working on the audio editing, I guess the audio engineering side of this thing to make it pleasing to the ear. I've really messed with the gain levels and the EQ, and I'm really hoping that this is a more pleasant thing to listen to. I did get an email from a listener who I can't tell what your name is, and you didn't leave a signature there. This is some letters and numbers for your email address. But the question was, where did the title music come from? I actually wrote that. That's a little musical march thing that I wrote for myself, just kind of because I used a little, I think it was called Mixcraft 8, I think is what it was. And yeah, it's a DAW, a digital audio workspace, I think is what that's short for. And yeah, I just kind of plugged it in, wrote a little tune. It was sort of I was sort of trying to figure out if I could do like a marching band kind of a sound. I write music, and I hadn't ever tried to write any sort of orchestral pieces. And my efforts to do that have been mixed at best. But this marching band thing I kind of liked. I thought, that's kind of upbeat and interesting. And so, I wrote that little ditty that you hear at the start of this podcast just on a piece of digital software. And so that's where that came from. As I mentioned in the last episode, this book was selected by, so feel free to write in with questions and I will answer them. And that's a question that I've had before. And so I figured rather than just answer it directly via email, which I did, I would also answer it on the show in case anyone else is wondering. Again, if you want to reach me, you can reach me at whatstomreading@gmail.com with any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. And if they are questions that I get fairly regularly, then I will answer them on the air, as it were. So as I mentioned in the last episode, this book, Hard Times, was selected by a random number generator from a list of over 100 other books that I have been meaning to cover. I'm not planning these books out very far in advance because I want to leave space for new books to be included. So from now on, whenever a listener recommends a book, I'm going to read it and add it to the pool of books in my overall list. Then every time I record a new episode, I am going to spin up the random number generator again and pick the next book. This kind of keeps things from becoming too set in stone and boring for me. I don't actually like predictability and planning all that much, in case you couldn't tell with this show. It also allows equal odds of a listener recommended book to be included in any given episode. Fair? I think that sounds fair. And so far, it's been so good. On that note, the next episode of the podcast will be the book Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And it's a crazy random coincidence that I would have Jane Austen immediately following after Charles Dickens. That is not an order that I would have normally chosen, but that's the beauty of this system. There's no way, like I said, that I would have chosen to do these two books back to back. But fate has spoken, and I will not cheat the system. So we are going to be sticking to great English literature for the next couple of episodes. And after that, we'll see where we end up going. I wanted to thank you all as well for your continued support. So great to hear from you. Your book recommendations and your notes on the show have been extremely valuable to me. I particularly wanted to thank those of you who have chosen to share the show with a friend. And I've noticed some very significant growth in the show lately, and that's always a good thing. It really makes the whole process of writing, recording, and editing these episodes just totally worth it for me. So thank you. If you want to get in touch with me, like I said, you can reach me at whatstomreading@gmail.com. This week's quality control suggestion among the audio changes is, if you can't tell, and you probably can't tell because I'm not doing a very good job of it, but it's for me to slow down a little bit. slow down a little bit. And so that it feels like I've practiced this a little bit to slow down my speech. And it feels sort of like marching through molasses. But I want to make sure that this is a pleasant listener experience for everyone. So I'm taking that suggestion into effect starting now. Let's hope I can keep it up. For those of you who, like me, enjoy a much faster listening experience, you can just crank up the speed on your player, and hopefully that does the trick. All right, without further ado, let's get on with the show. I'm going to break with my tradition on works of fiction for this one, since this book is very old and is already in the public domain. Let's face it, if you haven't read it by now, it's either because it's on your list, quote unquote, I know how that goes, believe me, or you aren't really that interested in it. It's definitely not because it just came out and you haven't had the opportunity yet. And if you aren't terribly interested, I am going to do my best to change your mind. Dickens is, I think, one of the all-time great authors for a reason. My favorite part of his writing is and always will be the prose. It's just such a flowery, fancy, delightful way to communicate. I have a deep envy for his ability to turn a phrase and paint pictures with words. He is, without a doubt, one of the greatest storytellers in history. Yet, this book is, to be somewhat blunt, a little bit boring. It's not the sort of thing that you can read casually. I therefore 100% understand why you might not have read it yet. Perhaps you've started it and said, nope, not today, like I do every time I try to read anything by the great old Russian authors or like Nietzsche or something like that. It's just not the sort of thing that you can do while folding laundry or walking through the park. So with the assumption that you've either never read this book or that you could do with a bit of a refresher if you have, I have prepared a brief synopsis of the story. As I said, ordinarily on works of fiction, I would be worried about spoilers, but this is a very, very old book, and let's face it, it's not exactly in a primetime slot for most people anyway. So here we go. Hard Times is one of Charles Dickens' grumpiest novels, and that's saying something. Set in the grimy, smoke-choked factory town of Coketown, Hard Times introduces us to Thomas Gradgrind, retired merchant, armchair philosopher, and full-time buzzkill. Gradgrind is a man who believes in facts, not imagination, not wonder, certainly not feelings. Just cold, hard data. If you can't quantify it, it doesn't matter. He's the kind of guy who would ban lullabies and fairy tales as wastes of time and condemn a sunset for its lack of efficiency. The sun should either be down or up, none of this flamboyant in-between nonsense. Old Thomas Gradgrind is the original facts don't care about your feelings guy, and he makes Ben Shapiro look easygoing and laid back by comparison. Gradgrind runs a school that's basically a Victorian spreadsheet. Children go in with curiosity and come out as pocket calculators. To give you an idea, the main teacher in the school is hilariously named Mr. Mchokumchild. Dickens is at his best when he is tongue-in-cheek, I think. Anyway, Gradgrind raises his own kids, Louisa and Tom, on this same joyless diet that's present in the main school. And then, just because he's a real humanitarian, he rescues a little girl named Sissy Jupe from the local circus. Her father, a clown, disappears, and Gradgrind decides to take her in, not out of an abundance of kindness, but to prove that even the daughter of a juggler can be reprogrammed by proper education. He sees her as a project. You'll be shocked to hear it doesn't go according to plan. Fast forward a few years, Tom has grown into a full-blown hedonist with a gambling problem and zero conscience. Louisa, poor thing, is emotionally flatlined. There's next to nothing going on in her heart. All calculations are made in the cold tablets of her frontal lobe. She's so disconnected from her inner world that when she agrees to marry her father's pompous, quote, self-made friend, Mr. Bounderby, who is roughly twice her age and brags constantly about surviving childhood in a drain pipe, she doesn't even flinch. She doesn't love him. She doesn't hate him. She just sort of agrees, like she's making a transaction and all of the paperwork appears to be in order. Meanwhile, Bounderby is the embodiment of smugness. He owns a factory, he owns a bank, and he owns the world's largest supply of self-importance. He constantly calls himself a self-made man, which turns out to be a lie, but we'll get to that later. Enter Stephen Blackpool, a working-class hand, which is Dickens' way of referring to the factory workers. Stephen is in love with Rachel, a fellow worker who's basically sweet sainthood in a bonnet. But he can't marry her because he's already married to a chronic absentee alcoholic who goes on months-long benders but refuses to die or stay gone. When he asks Bounderby about a divorce, he's told, politely but firmly, that only the rich can afford justice. So Stephen trudges back to his life of quiet work and suffering, longing to be with Rachel, but doomed to be alone. Now here's where things get messy. A fancy, bored aristocrat named James Harthouse shows up in Coketown to dabble in politics. He's Gradgrind's new golden boy, handsome, clever, and completely hollow. He meets Louisa, senses the emotional vacuum she's living in, and decides to fill it. With what, you might ask? Well, the only thing he cares about, of course, himself. He sets out to seduce her, not out of love or desire, but as a sick kind of intellectual experiment. He's just that kind of guy. Mrs. Sparsit, Bounderby's live-in ex-aristocrat/gossip queen, spots the affair in progress and begins stalking Louisa like a Victorian Nancy Drew. But the affair never quite happens. It kind of, sort of implies that it does, but it never quite materializes on paper. Louisa reaches her emotional limit, finally, and runs away, but not into Harthouse's arms, nor the arms of her pompous husband. Rather, she bolts back to her father, breaks down, and tells him that his facts-only philosophical upbringing has left her totally unprepared for real life, where big, messy feelings are everywhere to be felt and navigated. Her marriage is a sham. Her own emotions are a mystery to her, and she might now be in love with a walking red flag and about to step out on a husband who she does not love. So Louisa says to her father, "How could you give me life and take from me all the inappreciable things that raise it from the state of conscious death? Where are the graces of my soul? Where are the sentiments of my heart? What have you done, O Father? What have you done with the garden that should have bloomed once in this great wilderness here?" said Louisa as she touched her heart. Gradgrind is stunned, and to his credit, he listens. It's a full-on existential gut punch for the old man. For the first time, he sees that his philosophy may have been less than bulletproof. In fact, it's actually completely foolish. Meanwhile, Stephen Blackpool gets railroaded, literally and figuratively. Remember Tom, Louisa's little rotten brother? He robs the Bounderby Bank and pins it on Stephen, who was conveniently seen loitering outside the building for several nights, because Tom told him to wait there, promising help that never came. Stephen flees town, hoping to find work and maybe clear his name. On his way back to set the record straight, though, he falls into a giant pit ominously called Old Hell Shaft, which might be the least subtle metaphor in all of Dickens. Louisa and sweet Rachel find him broken and dying, and he gives a final, heartfelt goodbye to Rachel. Stephen goes out with dignity, the working-class martyr in a rigged system. Again, this is before they invented subtlety in writing, and Dickens wasn't afraid to lay it on thick at times. He's one of the all-time greats, so he doesn't have to worry about sounding preachy. He can do what he wants because he can write passages like this. "It is said that every life has its roses and thorns. There seemed, however, to have been a misadventure or mistake in Stephen's case, whereby somebody else had become possessed of his roses, and he had become possessed of someone else's thorns in addition to his own. Stephen Blackpool fell into the loneliest of lives, the life of solitude among a familiar crowd. The stranger in the land who looks into 10,000 faces for some answering look and never finds it is in cheering society as compared with him who passes 10 averted faces daily that were once the countenances of friends." Again, if you can write prose like that, then you can moralize about the perils of capitalism and utilitarianism as much as you want. So after Stephen's death comes the great unraveling. Bounderby's big lie is exposed. Mrs. Pegler, the mysterious old lady who we met earlier in the book, she's not just some dotty fan of Bounderby's. She's actually his loving and devoted mother, who adored him, raised him well, and whom he paid to stay far, far away so he could sell his bogus rags to riches backstory where he grew up in a gutter. When word of this gets out, Bounderby fires Mrs. Sparsit in a fit of rage and then dies alone, as poetic justice demands. Tom, the actual bank robber, is smuggled out of the country by a team of circus performers. Yes, really, the circus is back in town. Sleary, the lisping circus master, orchestrates the whole thing in an oddly touching gesture of loyalty to Sissy, the daughter of one of their own. Bitzer, one of Gradgrind's most successful pupils, and a perfect robot of fact-based education, tries to stop the escape but is outmaneuvered, almost like compassion beats logic at the end of the day. In the end, we get a full Dickensian wrap-up. Thomas Gradgrind renounces his ideology and dedicates his life to social reform. He leans out his window on Christmas morning and asks a lad to run to the market and buy the biggest turkey he can find for Tiny Tim's family, and he stops saying bah humbug altogether. Or maybe that was a different Dickens story, but it's kind of the same. Tom dies far from home, full of regrets. Bounderby dies alone and unloved after the world discovers he is a fraud. Louisa doesn't remarry, doesn't have children, but, thanks to Sissy, finally learns how to live with some empathy. And Sissy, well, she gets the happy ending. She marries, has kids, and brings back light into the Gradgrind home, one bedtime story at a time. All right, that's the plot summary in a nutshell. Obviously, I had to gloss over a few things. There are dozens of beautifully crafted scenes in the novel and excellent characters that are well worth your time and attention should you choose to pick up this book. But if not, then I think I've more or less covered the main themes and central beats of the book. Now let's dig into the meat of the story, the allegory, the metaphor. Let's talk about what's really going on under the soot-stained surface of Hard Times. Because Charles Dickens, he wasn't just writing about a cranky old merchant, a sad girl in a bad marriage, and a man who tragically falls down a metaphor pit. Oh no, he was mad. And not just Victorian angry, we're talking full-on literary rage mode here. This book is a middle finger to the dehumanizing effects of industrialism, utilitarianism, and the soul-crushing ideology of efficiency capitalism uber alles. Gosh, that was a mouthful. Sometimes these things are easier to write than to read, folks. Let's start with utilitarianism. That's the philosophical flavor of the day in Coketown. Greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? But here's the kicker. What happens when you start measuring human life like a balance sheet? When feelings are liabilities and imagination is just an inefficiency. You get people like Thomas Gradgrind, a man who thinks the purpose of education is to cram kids full of trivia until they forget how to wonder. A man who raises his children like little walking census reports, and then acts shocked when one becomes a criminal and the other collapses into existential despair. It's like he built little robots out of porcelain and then was baffled when they cracked and shattered under pressure. These children of his are not well adjusted and find themselves totally unprepared to deal with the twists and turns of life. Dickens is not subtle about it. Again, he practically screams you can't build a good society by gutting all the color out of human life. Facts are great. They keep bridges standing and stop ships from sinking. But they're just not enough. People need beauty, imagination, connection, stories. That's why Sissy Jupe, the girl from the circus, ends up being the emotional heart of this story. She is the antidote to everything Gradgrind stands for. She doesn't run on 100 proof logic alone. She runs on love and loyalty and bedtime stories. She isn't much for rattling off facts about crop yields per acre, but she knows how to comfort a crying child and challenge a corrupt ideology. She's the real success story here. And speaking of corruption, let's talk about Bounderby. Oh, Bounderby. He is the human embodiment of every LinkedIn post about grinding your way to success. Constantly boasting that he rose from rags to riches, he turns out to be a complete fraud. Not a self-made man, but a man-made myth. He didn't pull himself up by his bootstraps. His poor mother laced them up for him every day, and he just kicked her to the curb for the trouble. Dickens seems to be saying, beware of people who loudly claim to be self-made. Odds are there's a whole silent chorus of folks in the background who did the real work. In fact, I am very wary of anyone who claims to be entirely self-made in general. I have had the privilege of interviewing a large number of very successful people over the years, and the one universal constant between them is that the good ones always seem to be able to point to their mentors, helpers, support system, and most often their mothers for helping them to get where they are in life. Anytime I meet someone who claims to be entirely self-made, I tend to think that they haven't done enough thinking about their true origin story. A lack of gratitude usually signifies a lack of humility, which is a big red flag that says this person does not play well with others. I once knew a girl back in my undergrad education who was so determined to claim as many victim bucks for herself as she could that she regularly engaged in massive, easily falsifiable lies. She was, by all accounts, not lacking in raw intelligence, but her Bounderby-like desperation to be admired for overcoming adversity sent her on a constant sort of victimhood tour. Eventually, she claimed to have been accepted to a very prestigious law school, which, upon cursory examination by a member of our team, didn't actually exist. Now, normally, I would say that the best thing to do would be to ignore her and leave her alone in her fantasy world. People can sense a fraud, and usually there's not too much of a risk to the general population. You know, sociopaths and psychopaths and people who don't live in reality and are willing to lie for their personal aggrandizement and other people's expenses, they tend to burn through social groups pretty fast, and people find them out quickly. Maybe they're able to pull the wool over someone's eyes for a while, but eventually they get found out and they have to move on to another group, sort of like a traveling parasite. But another member of my team at that time believed that her dishonesty presented a sort of liability to the group where we had to do projects and things together. And he decided to confront her. Of course, it did not go well when presented with her own falsehoods. This young lady, rather than come clean, attempted to turn the tables on her accuser by crying loudly and telling him that he looked exactly like an uncle who abused her, and that was also very triggering to her. It was a very confusing situation for all the rest of us who were just sitting in the middle of a college classroom, having a little group discussion there. Now, I obviously don't presume to know her whole life, and if she was abused, then obviously she certainly has my sympathy. Yet her weaponization of that fact, or falsehood, as the case may be, in that moment seemed and was obviously a very naked attempt to deflect the group from her lies and regain the victimhood initiative, as it were. And we all left that interaction feeling just awful, just so uncomfortable. But we learned our lesson. Don't question her stories, right? Or she'll throw some sort of wild accusation at you that is completely unfounded and inappropriate. But she'll do it as a defense mechanism to protect her lies. That was the last time I ever spoke to that young lady. But a couple of years later, I ran into someone from her hometown. And during a short discussion, we sort of made the connection of our mutual acquaintance there. And I learned that Not only had the young lady not gone on to attend the made-up prestigious law school, but that she had sort of continued on her rampage of lies and burned every bridge in the community, and she is now reaping the rewards of a life spent trying to glorify herself through fabricated stories of hardship and crushing the people who question her on that. I don't know where she is today, but I thought of her when I read about Bounderby and his fate. Lies aren't merely distortions or falsehoods. They are corrosive to the truth itself. They are corrosive to life itself. They undermine the social fabric of trust that just must exist between us all in order for us to live peacefully together. A liar who is motivated to get gain for themselves through deception is sort of like a fox in the hen house. They undermine the social institutions and the shortcuts that we all have in our brains to allow us to trust one another without knowing each other too deeply, right? If a certain portion of the population were liars and completely untrustworthy, then society as we know it would break down. We wouldn't be able to even go to the grocery store. Those transactions would be suspect every time. You wouldn't be able to buy a bottle of milk from someone without wondering if it was, white paint or crushed shells mixed with water or something like that, right? Like a certain amount of trust is necessary in order for society to thrive and to be cohesive. And so liars, they're actually a threat to all of us. When Bounderby went around pretending to be a self-made man in hard times here, when he says that he grew up in the gutter and that, he pulled himself up by his bootstraps, he wasn't just being a blowhard and a hack and really annoying. He was actually tearing at the social fabric itself. And he used that falsehood of his to manipulate his low-level employees into spilling their blood, sweat, and tears in his factory so that they too could be like him and lift themselves up. And they believed that he was one of them, and the people that he was in society with, high society with, the other wealthy people, he was able to sort of pretend that he was a self-made man and that he implied that he was better than them because they inherited their wealth or they were part of an aristocratic system, whereas he came from literally nothing, and then one foot in front of the other through his massive intellect and his hard work and his talent and his favor of the gods and all these other lies, right? He was able to get to his position there. It's just a really shallow way to justify to all people why you are better than them. And it's a lie. And Dickens obviously found Bounderby's actions so reprehensible that he reserved the poorest fate in the story for this man. He was ruined financially, socially humiliated, cuckolded essentially, and then abandoned by his peers and left to die alone in ignominy and infamy. And again, Dickens isn't required to use subtlety, right? When he's making a point, Bounderby is a representative of what Dickens viewed as a certain type of uber capitalist lie that can poison the well for everybody. So don't be like Bounderby, kids. Tell the truth. Be humble. Be honest about who you are and where you came from. And most of all, be grateful. No man is an island and nobody ever earned success on their own. An attitude of gratitude toward the people who have helped you get where you are is essential. Those of us who will be blessed with great success should be generous to those who did not have our good fortune. Again, I've had the privilege of talking to many extraordinarily successful men and women through my connections at a top flight business school. I'm highly blessed by that. I would never obviously claim to be one of them, but I've had the opportunity to speak to a good number of them and to rub shoulders with them a little bit. And the best of them understand that success and failure often comes down to the flip of a coin, the edge of a knife, right? And they're grateful that their number came up and that they dedicate, that they won the lottery essentially. Obviously, they were well prepared and in the right place at the right time and had the discipline to take advantage of opportunities when they arose. But they know that other people are also dedicated and hardworking and talented, and they just don't ever catch their lucky break, right? That can totally happen. And these people who are humble, they dedicate themselves to giving back to the community, and especially to the people who help them succeed along the way. The worst of them, though, they brag about all of the attributes that they have, which they believe influence the coin flip in some way. They're not grateful to anyone in their lives. In fact, just like Bounderby, they'll go on and on about all the adversity they had to overcome to gain their vast fortune or whatever. They then use their own fabricated propaganda to justify their greed and their selfishness and holding on to those things. Other people would have these things if they were just as morally upright as I am, that sort of thing. These are the people who I and you should carefully avoid, and who I'm never surprised to later discover that they're engaged in morally dubious or outright fraudulent behavior in their personal and professional lives. This is actually something that just today, a great example of this. I started a new book. It was one that Audible recommended to me and it was on sale. And so I was like, yeah, okay, I'll pick it up and go for it. And I started it. And just within the first chapter, I was like, woof, this kid is pompous. Really, really has an inflated sense of his own self-importance. And just going on and on about how lame his parents were, how they raised him in a religious household and told him not to question things. And then that he went to these schools and these teachers tried to, tell him how the world worked, but he saw through the lies of the Jedi and all the cringe stuff that 22-year-old kids always say. They're like, I'm not like all the other girls. I'm the speciest. And just going on and on about like, I don't need traditional religion. I don't need traditional, ways of understanding. I made my own. I fabricated everything out of whole cloth, and look at me. I'm a gazillionaire now. And I thought, man, this is crazy. I had to pause it because I was like dying of cringe. So I decided to Google the guy, and yeah, sure enough, he's a crook. Sure enough, he's been indicted. He's facing several counts of fraud because it's fraudulent. It's anyone who's acting that way, puffing their chest out like that. You just know that you can't trust him. And there you go. I returned the audiobook and I'm moving on with my life. Didn't have to listen to another word of that hack. So it's like I said, it's not a long hop from exaggerating to lying to cheating to stealing and then on to basically the unspeakable, right? It all starts from a desire toward this self-aggrandizement, and it can lead to very broken places indeed. And Dickens teaches that lesson in Hard Times very, very well. Then there's the factory system. Dickens obviously wasn't a huge fan, in case that wasn't clear from the fact that he named the town Coke Town and had soot coming out of every window. The workers, who he called hands to emphasize sort of their replaceability and dehumanize them in a bit, they're trapped in a system that treats them like interchangeable machine parts. And Stephen Blackpool's life is one long, quiet tragedy. He can't get justice. He can't get love. He can't even clear his name without falling into a literal hellhole. And yet he never becomes bitter. He remains good and gentle. And for that, Dickens gives him a kind of like moral sainthood, albeit posthumously. While Bounderby's death is lonesome and ignominious, having become a hiss and a byword among his friends and associates, Stephen Blackpool's death is a sort of beautiful tragedy. Dickens portrays him as a noble victim of a system that has been literally rigged against him. And at times, the treatment seems a little heavy-handed, particularly for those of us who have had the experience of working with, laborers, blue-collar workers. There's dignity, nobility, and a certain type of gritty cachet that comes with men who break their backs for a living. Many of them, indeed, are honorable, honest, and just as noble as Stephen Blackpool. Yet nobody who has ever actually worked for a blue-collar living has done so under the illusion that their colleagues are saints. I have worked many blue-collar jobs. I've swung hammer for a living many times, and without casting any aspersions on the hard workers who I worked with, they're prone to their own sorts of vices, which can be just as corrosive to the soul and the community. They're not saints, and they would themselves would never claim to be, right? So life, unfortunately, doesn't fit as neatly into the boxes that metaphor-heavy novels tend to represent. So like a freshman reading of a book like Hard Times might lead to the conclusion that blue-collar workers are the noblest of all God's creatures and that all capitalists are greedy, lying frauds, right? They might also conclude that utilitarian considerations and logic must always yield to the impulses of the heart. Society, of course, needs all these things in their proper spaces. There are good reasons why we don't let poets design our bridges and why we don't turn over the global banking system to, welders and machinists, right? The people have specialties, and it's okay that we have a variety of people who are working in a variety of spheres. In fact, it's great. It's one of the things that makes humanity so wonderful. So if Louisa in the novel is sort of the emotional cautionary tale and Stephen's the quiet martyr, Sissy is the hopeful prophet type, right? She's proof that the world doesn't have to be this way, that we can all live with compassion, that kindness matters more than cleverness, and that bedtime stories might be more important than balance sheets. This is all very good and very true, right? Human connection ought to be everyone's highest priority, but ultimately, Hard Times, from Dickens' perspective, it's not just an indictment of Victorian England, which obviously that's the framework that he was writing in. It's also kind of a warning shot aimed at us, right? Our obsession with productivity, with data, with measurable success. Dickens, he maybe has a word to say on that. And you saw how easy it is to turn schools into testing centers, workers into cogs, and children into emotionally stunted efficiency machines. That was certainly the case in his time. And he proposed the antidote in this book of grace, imagination, connection, human messiness, and all the unmeasurable stuff, right? Again, I'd encourage you, my friends, to take Hard Times for what it is. It's one of the great allegorical, metaphorical pieces of English literature written by one of the greatest authors in history. Dickens, he had an argument, and he wanted to show that it is possible for workers to be exploited. It's possible for capitalists to lie and swindle and be frauds. It is possible for schoolmasters to prioritize facts and figures to such a degree that feeling and beauty are pushed to the sidelines. It's possible that an upbringing based entirely on logic and fact can lead to a cold and miserable life devoid of joy and adventure. All these things are possible, and we ought to take them into consideration in our own lives. This book, though, was written to make people think, and think you should, right? But don't let your thinking stall at the corners of the book itself. Just because these things are possible doesn't mean that they are always the case in reality. It's equally possible for workers to be lazy and entitled scoundrels. It's possible for capitalists to be innovators who create things that raise humanity itself and build communities and do a lot of good in the world. It's possible for schoolmasters to become so obsessed with feelings of the heart that they entirely abandon facts, logic, and intellectual rigor of any sort. It's possible that an upbringing based entirely on self-consciousness and self-indulgence can lead to a cold and miserable life devoid of any sense of purpose or progress, just the same way that upbringing of focusing only on facts and logic, right? If you're focused only on yourself and your feelings, that also doesn't lead to happy places, right? Like people who are obsessed with themselves are miserable and constantly thinking about themselves. I've heard it said that there's no difference between self-consciousness and anxiety. It's the same thing. It's the same. If you're thinking about yourself, you're anxious. If you're focused on yourself, then you're focused on, your pain, your discomfort, the things that you're worried about, the things that you don't have. You're doing constant inventory and comparison. It's just not a good place to be, and it doesn't lead to happy places. So all these things that I just mentioned there, they're just as possible as the world that Dickens portrayed in Hard Times, but that's not what he wrote the book about, right? And I don't think there's many of us who would look at our modern educational system and criticize it for being too rigorous and focused on productivity, right? Nobody honest is looking around wondering why people are, never critical of capitalists and why nobody is looking out for workers and why nobody talks about their feelings, right? Like we don't have those problems in this day and age. In fact, we've kind of swung maybe on the opposite way with the pendulum, and balance is a critical component of life. Dickens sort of puts his thumb on the scale toward beautiful things because he was an artist, and because during that time in Victorian England, it was kind of a severe culture, severe society, and he wanted to say, no, beauty and feeling and emotional connection, all those things are necessary parts of the human, the healthy human heart. And he had a good point then, because during Victorian England, during that time period, he probably witnessed a lot more cold, calculating behavior, and a lot of that's at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. He probably saw a lot more capitalist exploitation of workers who were working in just hideous conditions, working very, very, very long hours and very, very unsafe, cramped conditions, and had no quality of life whatsoever. And so for Dickens, the world of Hard Times is the truth. And he advocated against that. And he's actually, I think he's one of the big reasons, he among other artists are one of the big reasons why that sort of, soot-covered industrialist, capitalist, utilitarian, logic-driven, bottom-line-driven society, I think his writing and others like him are the reason why that society is gone. Now we live in a feelings-first society, and we probably do need to kind of swing back towards, some efficiency and some productivity, and focusing on, facts rather than how we feel about, what we claim to be subjective realities around us. Obviously, like I said, life is a balance. And if we were all poets, then there would be nothing to eat, right? There's just as much nobility and a deal more utility, I would say, in being someone who feeds others, clothes others, builds shelters for others, and does all the things needed to keep society moving along. So take the beauty into your heart, let it lift you up while your hands and your head stay busy with the work of life. And that's my 2 cents anyway. You can take it or leave it. And that's going to do it basically for our analysis today. Thank you all for listening. I know this was a little bit of a different one here. It's kind of a hybrid where, if I'm talking about a nonfiction book, then I can go on a lot about the author's ideas and still incentivize you to read the book. But if I'm talking about fiction, then I don't want to spoil the storyline. But I sort of made an exception here because this is a very old book it's much less about the characters and the plot than it is about the message that Dickens was trying to send. And so in a way, this kind of falls into the category of literary, almost like a historical fiction at this point is the way I think most people will look at it. So, thank you all for listening. I appreciate your support. If you haven't already, please share the show with someone who you think would get a kick out of it. It's been awesome to see the growth of the show lately. It's been really, really great. And I can't thank you all enough. Also, if you wouldn't mind, if you have a minute or two, just dropping a 5-star review for the show, on whatever podcast service you use. I would really appreciate that as well. I don't often ask for reviews, and I know you're busy, but apparently that's an important component in whether the great algorithm gods will share this show with other listeners. So thank you all very much. If you're interested in supporting my work as an author, please check out my book, Human Cure. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Proceeds from that book are being donated to breast cancer research, so it's all for a good cause. It's also a pretty good book, if I do say so myself. So still working on the audiobook. I'll make an announcement about that when it's ready. But if you're interested in hearing more about Human Cure, then stay tuned after the show, and there will be a little sizzle reel that will play for it. So, all right, let's wrap it up. Have a good day. You deserve it.